Chapter 5. Strategy, Tactics, and Guiding Principles. The development of a strategy follows the progression given earlier: copying, comparing, compiling, computing, coordinating, and creating, and parallels the development of expertise. The first two levels, copying and comparing, correspond to defining an objective, that is, a goal, such as getting out of debt, becoming a millionaire, retiring early, or running a marathon. The next two levels, compiling and computing, correspond to following a plan, which is a sequence of individual actions or tactics, called tips in personal finance parlance. Don't confuse a plan with a strategy. A plan comprises a goal and a sequence of actions, but it doesn't describe the guiding principles. A strategy requires all three ingredients and thus requires coordination and creativity. Now, there are many plans available on the market following a permutation of a formula of the type X days or tips to success in Y using the Z method, where X is a number, typically 7, 21, 30, or 365 days, or 10, 12, 50, or 100 tips. Y is something desirable, typically $1 million, losing weight, getting a date, and so on. And Z is some kind of secret, or often the author's autobiography. A plan can be thought of as a sequential set of instructions. If you do this, followed by this and that, and several additional steps, you'll end up at the goal. Plans work well if the number of degrees of freedom is limited so that few things can go wrong. That is, not according to plan. However, the more complex the situation, and life is generally more complex than assembling a piece of Swedish furniture, the greater the chance of something going wrong due to the following three types of factors. Unknown unknowns, which are uncertain factors that nobody is aware of, also known as surprises. Unknown knowns, which are certain factors that you're not aware of, meaning that you got the wrong plan, also known as I told you so. And known unknowns, which are uncertain factors that you are aware of, meaning that the plan is correct but lacking precision, also known as bad luck or bad design. The construction of a plan, that is, the way the tactics are coordinated and created, follows a set of guiding principles. If a plan shows how to put instructions together, then guiding principles show how to put a plan together and create a strategy. Strategic thinking, that is, the creation of plans, is what separates the last two levels, coordinating and creating, from the first four levels. Compared to a plan which may be thought of as a string of actions, subject to complete failure if it breaks, a strategy is better thought of as a web of actions. A web does not fail catastrophically if it's cut in a single or even a few places. It's resilient, whereas a plan is not. This is why having a strategy is much preferred to having a plan. A web comprises and connects a person's thoughts, ideas, experiences, memories, goals, values, desires, connections, assets, liabilities, predictions, and expectations. Here, a larger inventory of the aforementioned means there's a greater variety of possible strategies, and that any given plan becomes more flexible. Focusing solely on the coordination aspect and ignoring the tactics can result in clueless manager syndrome. Conversely, focusing solely on the knowledge of tactics or skills described in Chapter 4 would only produce a person with a multitude of hobbies. Only the combination of skills and coordination will unleash the creativity of an expert. Creative synthesis occurs when you're able to see principles as an abstract model representation and apply the abstracted model elsewhere. With experience, you'll see that the number of such models in the world is actually quite limited. What this means is that any kind of human understanding is based on a small number of representations that are repeated over and over. Perhaps this is because humans are only capable of thinking in certain limited ways. So the same methods are discovered independently over and over by successful experts in different fields. Or perhaps experts tend to borrow from each other, seeking inspiration elsewhere. It is probably a combination. This means that one doesn't need another 10,000 hours to become an expert in another field, even if it's only marginally related. It means that it's easier to master several different fields than is commonly assumed. It's important to understand that doing the right thing, having a good strategy, is much more important than doing things right, having good tactics. This is why this book is short on tactics and long on strategies. Strategy is about defining the end goals. Tactics is about the means to those ends. One thing that was crucial in formulating the strategy towards a Renaissance life with financial independence was that the means be widely available. A strategy that relies on means that are impossible to replicate for most people, like inheriting $1 million, winning the lottery, being the rare inventor or author that actually gets his great ideas commercialized, being the first one in on a new technology, or simply riding a leveraged asset in a financial bubble and getting out at the right time, or relying on yet-to-exist communities or ways of life, are not very effective. For fear of repeating myself and boring the listener, the strategy is what is going to create success, and it is to a large extent what separates successful people from unsuccessful people. The tactics, less so, as most are capable of good performance on the tactical level. For progress, it's essential to base goals on a consistent strategy that guides individual tactics. There's more than one way to spin a strategic web, and some ways are better than others. Given a capable and intelligent person or group of people, errors rarely originate in the execution of a plan, though the plan itself may fail. Instead, errors occur in the principles underlying the development of the plan. Therefore, it's important to base a plan or a framework on the correct principles. Consider again the 4 different economic classifications described in Chapter 3: salaryman, working man, businessman, and Renaissance man. Each type of person is characterized by very different strategies. The Renaissance strategy is based on a combination of consilience, a specific way of weaving widely different tools and ideas together to solve complex problems, and resilience, which is based on the principles of modularity, diversity, and slack, or loosely coupled feedback processes. Resilience is the foundation of most behaviors observed in nature. After all, if they weren't resilient, they would be extinct. While not completely equivalent, consilience shares a lot with typical business strategies which can be transferred to the individual sphere. Combining resilience and consilience defines the Renaissance man, and they will be used in Chapter 6 to form a complete strategy that will make a committed person financially independent in a handful of years. 5.1. Strategic Principles. The best way to understand the Renaissance man is through the use of an analogy, a university. Most universities research and teach a wide variety of subjects that are further split into courses taught by corresponding experts. In other words, the subjects are diversified. This means that if any one or even several subjects suddenly become obsolete, the university as a whole would still function. The experts are gathered into departments and institutes. Typically, experts within their respective departments are strongly connected, like physics to physics. Usually, they will also connect somewhat more loosely in interdisciplinary studies with other departments in the institute, like physics to astronomy. And sometimes they may go outside the institute and connect with experts at other institutes, like physics to history. For a university, each institute and each department functions almost independently of the other. In other words, a university is modularized, and through the collaborations that connect different kinds of expertise, new knowledge and complex solutions are created. Therefore, a university is consilient. Despite its complexity, a university isn't subject to catastrophic failure whenever a professor has to cancel a lecture due to illness, or a meeting, or whenever students don't come back in time after spring break, or when equipment doesn't show up on schedule, or a laboratory gets flooded by a rainstorm. People, professors, students, and administrators, simply rearrange and reschedule without issue, because the entire system is built on a foundation of loosely coupled feedbacks. Hence, jarring one part of the system does not noticeably affect the other parts. Compare this to the businessman, who in many respects is similar, except that loose feedbacks, which in the business world are known as inefficiencies because time is money, are now tightly coupled feedbacks. A business is like a nuclear power plant, which is a complex and tightly coupled system. Here, many fail-safes, over a dozen for some parts, are in place to keep the system operating within its tolerance limits. If one fail-safe breaks, another picks up. Another example is the financial system. Rather than focusing on stable operation, like in nuclear power plants, financial engineering was used to leverage to maximize profit using relatively tiny differences between the strong opposing forces of assets and liabilities. That is, in the most general sense, by borrowing large amounts of money at a low interest rate and lending or sending it back out at a slightly higher rate. This tight coupling led to cascading failures, where failing parts caused other parts to fail, and so on, until a buffer was created by the taxpayers with the government as a proxy. Any part that is so tightly coupled that it can't be saved in the time it takes to decouple will fail. The salaryman is the simplest to understand, but not necessarily the simplest to live as. Real-world examples of something that is simple but tightly coupled includes most technology, as simple and tightly coupled is almost the definition of technology or a tool. Examples of industry thus comprise Industrialism 1.0, with its heavy, centralized engines. That is, dams, water supply and wastewater treatment, many conveyor belt systems, power looms, printing presses, and so on, down to most consumer technology. In short, these can all be stopped by throwing a switch, but their stoppage will not begin to affect other systems. The listener may note that those tool or cog-like qualities are actually ideal for a workforce, though not for the individuals themselves, many of whom have little control over their work and are just one paycheck away from being unable to pay rent or put food on the table. This is generally not a very desirable position to be in, so the aim for anyone in this category is to bring in more income by entrepreneuring complex systems as a businessman or by introducing slack, like emergency funds. Despite its inherent problems of lacking resilience and consilience, salaried work is amazingly popular among employees. It is heavily promoted by employers, who keep calling for better tools, or career professionals, to operate their ongoing concerns. Most books on personal finance or productivity focus on this area. The working man can accommodate shocks and short-term failures, like job loss or car breakdown, without destabilizing. Any industry that operates on a franchising or similar model, like the post office, and any industry that has seen outsourcing is an example of this. If a supplier fails, other suppliers are found within the time it takes to run out of inventory. Similarly, a new job is found before the emergency fund is depleted. However, since the strategy is preset by society, improvements are limited to tactics such as introducing more slack through reserve funds, using the proper amount of savings and insurance, and simply running the operation faster. Hence the fascination with life hacking, productivity, time-saving strategies, and the almost fanatical discussions of exactly how large the emergency fund should be, and how much one should spend on each budget category. Now, knowing the difference between the categories is one thing. But if you have ever been involved in a startup or gone through any other kind of transformation, you'll know that the underlying thinking and feeling of the finished stage can be very different from the thinking and feeling in the intermediate stage, which again is different from the initial stage, exactly because it's a complex, non-linear process. Therefore, we'll now discuss principles for creating the initial stage of consilience and resilience in a life strategy. 5.1.1 A modular design. Consumer culture can be seen as a modular structure, where problems are solved by driving to different stores to buy parts of the solution. This activity is made possible by driving to a job and exchanging time for money. Consider the cash flow of a salaryman who puts effort into a job that yields a wage, which is then spent on stuff that is used or consumed in an endless cycle. In this cycle, the consumer drives from his home to his job, where he gets money, and then to various stores, where he exchanges the money from his job for entertainment or stuff, which he drives back to his home. There is a tight coupling between the consumer, the job, and the stores, respectively. Here, the stores should be thought of broadly as shops, gyms, restaurants, dentists, plumbers, and so on. If the coupling to the job is severed, the advanced consumer with good credit, savings, or insurance can draw on those, but he still needs to go to stores for his needs, since everything requires external interaction in the form of regular trips to stores. I'm going to the store. Need anything? This is the consequence of specialization. The solutions to his problems, except the very specialized problem detailed in his job description, have been outsourced to the marketplace, and personal competence has been lost or replaced with information on where to find good deals. Eventually, he comes to depend strongly on this marketplace and hence on his continued employment. The individual consumers depend as strongly on an aggregate of stores as the stores depend on the aggregate of consumers. This explains advertising and the insistence for expert solutions, at least as far as the experts are concerned, for they need to earn money at their jobs too. This is outsourcing taken to its logical extreme. Many believe that extreme outsourcing, such as hiring assistants to write personal letters, walk their dog, and maybe talk to their spouses, is the way to go, counting on lower offshore living costs to maintain their comparative advantage, or even common outsourcing such as buying cake mixes, eating out, or having a plumber fix a clogged pipe. There are 3 reasons for this line of thinking. The first is misinformation. Consumers have become convinced that experts are needed for anything but the simplest task. The second is lack of personal skills. Knowing how to provide basic needs, like householding skills or how to stay happy, can be tremendously valuable. They can often be had very inexpensively compared to what the market offers. For instance, imagine the value of a support network of family and friends, or meaningful, unstressful work, compared to the hourly rate of a psychotherapist or stress-relieving prescription drugs, or that pre-processed food, which only needs to be heated, takes about 15 minutes of salary work to pay for, which is comparable to the time it takes to cook a similar meal from scratch. The third is lack of choices. When the market mainly offers full-time jobs, and the culture expects you to spend the rest of your time shopping and watching TV, it leaves little time for anything else. For individuals, outsourcing and comparative advantage can't remain advantageous in practice if taken to extremes. Yet in many ways, it has been taken too far already when people spend 8 hours a day for 30 years to buy electric can openers and marble towers. The solution is to reverse the outsourcing of ordinary life skills and gradually insource skills that were previously acquired in the marketplace to become less dependent on both a single source of income and a multitude of store services. This is both simple as well as tremendously challenging, because it requires a different kind of thinking. To get started, make a list of services and things acquired in the marketplace and start learning them on a need-to-know basis. Here is a short list of suggestions. 1. Haircutting. If necessary, change your hairstyle into something you can do. Be flexible. 2. Mending clothes and darning socks. 3. Cooking, preferably from scratch. Heating something in the microwave or mixing powder with water doesn't count. Again, if necessary, change your diet. 4. Buying something used instead of new or swapping something. There are now many websites to facilitate this. 5. Getting somewhere without a car. Use public transportation, commute by bicycle, or try walking a few blocks to the grocery. 6. Borrowing a book from the library. It's amazing how many people do not take advantage of this free resource. 7. Planting a garden of edible vegetables. Start with spices. Move on to high-cost, low-effort plants like tomatoes, not potatoes. Look into permaculture and intensive gardening. 8. Making simple, non-toxic household agents from scratch, like laundry detergent, toothpaste, insect killer, window cleaner, or beer. 9. Bicycle, motorcycle, or car maintenance. At least start by washing it yourself. Move on to fixing flats, cleaning, changing oil, and lubricating parts. Graduate to disassembling the drivetrain and engine. A very common and very good piece of career advice is not to work to earn money, but to work to learn new skills, gain new connections, and create new opportunities. Similarly, life advice should not exclusively be for the purpose of saving money, but to build social cohesion and connections and learn and exercise skills that can later create opportunities. This way, saving money won't be seen as consumer deprivation, but as producer manifestation. You're now making something rather than buying it. In my opinion, that makes you a more interesting person. Another very common and, in my opinion, very bad piece of advice, at least for the purposes of attaining success as a Renaissance man, is to pick and focus exclusively on one thing, say haircutting. This may be fine if you need to make a career out of it, but if you only need to provide for yourself and possibly a few friends, there's no need to specialize and develop all skills sufficient to be marketable. Just focus on your own hair. However, without changing one's frame of mind from that of a consumer, solving daily problems by learning a bunch of new things and doing them yourself runs the risk of turning into a multitude of hobbies, as supplies are ordered from stores, clubs are joined, or projects become overly ambitious, at least in terms of acquiring the tools and supplies. This could therefore easily end up strengthening the dependencies you are trying to leave behind, first running out to stores to buy supplies, and then running back to work to pay for them, leaving little time and room for the project, which eventually moves out to the garage with the rest of the stuff. Therefore, a requirement is to make each project self-supported. To understand what this means, divide the projects into the following 3 groups, and everything in between. 1. Projects that cost money. These are projects with startup costs and regular fixed costs. You need to buy equipment and pay subscription fees or replace equipment that wears out on a regular basis. Many sports fall under this category. 2. Projects that are free. These are projects with few startup costs, no fixed costs, and no cash flow, but possibly network connections of learning skills or providing some value. These projects are free. This can include using things you already have, such as a computer and an internet connection. 3. Projects that earn money. These are projects that are saving you money, or, even better, making you money. Not as in a hopeful future, but now. This could include learning how to cook, fixing computers, mowing people's lawns for the exercise, babysitting, and so on. It's of primary importance that a project produces value, even if that value isn't money and doesn't destroy value. Money leaving your pocket is a big warning sign that your activities fall into the first category. These should be avoided as much as possible and replaced with or modified into activities that are free, but provide the opportunity to learn, meet new people, and possibly earn money eventually. It's often quite possible to find a direct, yet free, replacement for a cash-negative activity. For instance, rather than going to the movies, you can borrow the DVD from the library or a friend about 6 months later if you just change your perspective. Don't get too ambitious about making money right away. Serendipity plays a larger role in the long term. For example, I replaced my fascination with buying computer hardware, which is an expensive money sink, with learning about the Nix operating system, which is free, and eventually ended up as the system administrator of the department I was working in simply because I was the one who knew the most when the previous admin left. Later, I turned the knowledge of Emacs and LaTeX from writing scientific articles into a freelancing job as a copy editor, which covered all my expenses working approximately 30 minutes a day on average. Blogging was another activity that started as a constructive way of channeling my writing and eventually turned into this book, which I typeset myself using what I learned as a copy editor. My interest in economics grew out of my interest in geopolitics and eventually turned into an interest in investing that I combined with my savings, which came from my interest in not spending money by doing more things myself. And so I was able to devise a custom-made portfolio that suited my particular investing temperament. Over time, this approach automatically develops several diversified streams of cash, as well as many more means to save money and keep that cash. Yet cash flow is not the only measure of independence. Some develop a social network so large that they can travel anywhere with little cost, look into courier services and couch surfing. And others develop such a wide set of skills along with an ability to sell those skills that they can work for room and board, as well as a small stipend. Conversely, it may be that an activity needs certain other connections. For example, using the company gym for free requires working for the company. In fact, companies often attempt to strengthen their employees' dependence on the company by providing benefits like healthcare, retirement plans, and other perks, which can be thought of as golden handcuffs. This must be kept in mind when resolving dependencies, especially connections to things outside your immediate control. The optimal solution in terms of dependencies and connections is for each project to be modularized and act as a holon. This means that the connections within the project are strong, whereas the connections between a project and the external world, other projects, are weak. Consequently, any given project doesn't depend very much on other projects and vice versa. They are also self-supporting and able to contribute to each other without depending on each other. It is resilient, much like the internet is resilient by design, as it can still function even when individual servers are down, as no single server is critical. Now, can you say the same thing about your life with regards to your job or your car? Another aspect of this optimal solution is that no single module dominates. The modules are diversified into approximately equally large sizes, which decreases risk. For instance, consider the university departments in Chapter 4. Each department in a university is about equally large and strong. This is unlike most people where one skill completely dominates all others. For example, one may be paid $25,000 per year for one activity, one's job, but less than $25 per year for one's next highest source of income, which is very likely to be the interest from a savings account. With proper diversification, if one income-generating module fails, it doesn't cause shockwaves through the rest of the system, because the external coupling to other modules is weak. In addition, if the external couplings connect to different modules rather than connecting to the same module, this lack of centralization protects the system from disruptions and cascading failures. Furthermore, the wider the diversification, the greater the likelihood of taking advantage of opportunities in the unique environment you reside in, or which you may find yourself residing in due to changing circumstances. This is the quintessence of adaptability. If you find yourself in a situation where you can't solve a problem, solve another problem. An omnivore always has more options available when solving the problem of eating. Note that simple, small, and slow modules are easier to manage than complicated, large, and fast modules. In managing modules, your reaction time should be faster than the characteristic timescale of anything you interact with, and you should be able to understand and control anything you engage with or in, as well as have the time to oversee the operation. While increasing size and complexity initially offers better benefits, the benefits decrease as increasingly higher costs of unforeseen problems swamp the system. Here the answer is to offload the complexity. But where do you begin, and where do you stop? Communities like the Shakers and the Quakers have thought about this and decided on some ground rules of what complexities to avoid. In general, the avoided complexities are the tightly coupled complexities. They will gladly borrow those, but they won't own them. To wit, they use a modularity strategy with loose couplings to avoid many problems. Slowness can be achieved through delayed gratification. In a world of scarcity, instant gratification is the optimal strategy. In a world of abundance, delayed gratification is the optimal strategy. Genetically, there's a preference for the former, which means that a mature person with a measure of self-control has an advantage, being able to wait for bargains. It also means if you have patience and don't depend on speed, there are fewer costs to be paid for the additional power that speed otherwise requires. It's helpful to master the art of waiting. We are prone to action, but often the problems we perceive as urgent turn out to be less than urgent. Sometimes they will even resolve themselves without any interaction. Using the modules correctly. The problem with most non-Renaissance goal setting is that it is either linear, that is, typically advancing along a predetermined career path, or it is separated from life. That is, a businessman may have many goals for the business, but few goals for himself. Similarly, salarymen and working men are likely to concentrate on only a single goal, such as maintaining a certain grade point average, getting a raise, accumulating a certain amount of money, getting promoted, or providing for a family. If there are multiple goals, they're likely to be separated by the work-life mantra. Here, one goal could be to provide for the family, and the other, unrelated goal, could be to reach a more ideal body weight. For the Renaissance man, however, the end goal is to blur the line between work and life, rather than a balance between work and life. Consider that almost any work becomes drudgery if you have to do it all day, every day, whereas scrubbing toilets or filing forms might not be too bad if you only have to do it 15 minutes a week. Ultimately, all modules should produce value in some form, such as better health, connections, or skills. And no module should consume the value produced by another. In particular, different productions should never cancel each other out, something which is all too common these days. For example, the invention of faster transport was canceled out by increasing travel distances. Larger productivity was canceled out by greater waste, and so on. With each module being self-supported, self-sufficient, internally integrated, and loosely coupled, with no module dominating the others, modules should be easily substitutable, but connected in a loose confederation of independent entities, aligned in a common goal, so that the sum is greater than the parts. In other words, arrange your life like an orchestra or a sports team, which don't depend on any single player. 5.1.2 Contingency Goal Setting. When pursuing a goal with an externally preset strategy, there's a strong tendency to focus on tactics to increase productivity, crank the machine faster to get done sooner. Here's how you can save 5 minutes while brushing your teeth, and here's how you can more effectively respond to emails, and here are 500 additional tips. The reason is that, other than working faster, most people really don't have a lot of freedom in terms of strategies for reaching their goal, since their strategies are locked in either externally by association, for example company procedures, or internally by habit or tradition. The only way is therefore to use slightly more effective tactics. Consider, for example, a factory floor, where the only allowed means of increasing productivity is to run each station faster. Now, admittedly, if you have 1 million employees, you can probably save 1 million minutes by getting your workers to spend 1 minute less on a given task. And if you're the business owner, it all adds up, maybe to $1 million for you and 1 million curses from the employees. Perhaps a redesign of the factory floor layout, that is a new production strategy, would be more effective than reusing the old strategy with slightly better tactics. For the individual person who is saving a minute here and a minute there to spend working towards his goal, another goal-seeking strategy would be more effective. Thus, to increase effectiveness, the focus must be on improving the strategy rather than improving on the tactics. Rather than using better tactics to reach goals, the goal-setting method must become better. Traditional goal setting is one-dimensional. It follows a process that essentially draws a line between A and B and then divides that line into small steps of actions that are taken in an incremental fashion. The problem with this approach is not so much the division into steps, which can be psychologically helpful, or a way of maintaining managerial control or measuring progress. Rather, it's in the goal setting itself, in particular the drawing of a straight line between A and B. This rarely works, since real-life goals are seldom straightforwardly one-dimensional. Most actions have side effects. This has a very important consequence. You can never do just one thing. When focusing on a single goal, side effects are ignored. For instance, the most popular single goal is building a career. This goal tends to ignore the sometimes adverse side effects such as complete dependence on the job, complete identification with the job, alienation from the spouse and any children, failing physical health, stress, and so on. If one manages to maintain a strict focus on the goal, then by the time the goal is reached, this strategy will have caused so much collateral damage that the work is not complete. The damage must be fixed first. Often this fixing creates additional problems. Consider a two-dimensional problem. A rudimentary example of this is achieving the famous work-life balance. While I don't believe there is such a thing, it will serve as an example. In this example, the challenge is to solve two problems simultaneously. The first problem, Goal 1, is the work problem, presumably working enough to build a career, display skills, gain power, money, awards, merit badges, or whatever. The ideal point is marked on the x-axis of our 2D goal space. The second problem, Goal 2, is the life problem, that is, having a happy home life, whatever that entails. The ideal point is marked on the y-axis of our 2D goal space. Together, the coordinates of Goal 1 and Goal 2 lead to our main goal, in which both sub-goals are achieved. There are two possible strategies for achieving our goals. Both strategies have side effects and affect the pursuit of both goals. The heterotelic strategy moves you significantly closer to Goal 1, taking you in the right direction along the x-axis, but away from Goal 2, taking you in the wrong direction along the y-axis. Heterotelic, a term borrowed from ecological philosophy, means different goals. Telos is Greek for goal. A heterotelic strategy includes finite behavior that is misdirected. This behavior is behavior that works against you. The homeotelic, meaning same goals, response, on the other hand, moves you closer to both goals. From a systematic perspective, the homeotelic response is the right strategy because it works against you the least. Another way to think of a heterotelic response to a problem is that it aims to fix a single symptom of, say, a disease. If the response causes undesirable side effects, additional drugs are taken in an attempt to fix these side effects. Here, many methods, or vectors in the goal space, are used to try to get closer to the desired goal. The heterotelic response makes particular symptoms more bearable and tends to encourage more problem-causing behavior. If hiding the symptoms is effective, then Liebig's law of the minimum suggests that additional symptoms will appear. If these in turn are treated heterotelically, then eventually the underlying problem will become so large that the system fails catastrophically, such as stress leading to burnout, which then leads to depression and causes a heart attack. Or the problem simply becomes unsolvable. Conversely, the homeotelic response aims to fix the entire problem, that is, cure the disease. Naturally, this is the ideal approach, but it requires a wiser approach to the problem. An important part of the system's thinking approach is to continuously increase the number of different problems that the strategy aims to solve, or the number of different goals that the strategy intends to meet. Take note, a good strategy solves multiple problems at the same time. Yet enormous amounts of resources in our society are aimed towards solving problems heterotelically. Sometimes the solution is the cause of a new problem. But thanks to short-term thinking, the focus is often on responding to problems rather than preventing them. Our culture seems to have an ongoing fascination with action, and reaction is ironically more visible than proaction. In fact, action in itself seems to be the cause of many problems. Consider, for example, the law or the tax code, which get incrementally more complex, though they don't reduce crime or make taxation more fair, respectively. To solve the problem, the cause of the problem must be understood. However, this is difficult and often impossible. Often there isn't one single cause. The human brain seems to be almost incapable of dealing with problems that have multiple causes. For instance, what is the cause of a financial crisis? It usually has at least 10 different causes, exactly because a crisis can be postponed by treating individual symptoms, after which the system collapses altogether. Any reasonably intelligent person blaming just a few of the many causes probably has other motivations. To simplify problem solving, it's paramount that problems remain small, slow, and diversified. This, of course, is anathema in a culture that prides itself on being bigger, faster, and more focused. Nevertheless, small, slow, and diversified must serve as a natural delimiter to remain on top of the situation. While this may not be understood by everybody else, it's fortunately possible to live a life based on this simple philosophy on your own, by not engaging in things that are beyond your comprehension and control. Effect mapping. Having realized that it's impossible to do just one thing, it follows that any action or behavior has a number of positive or negative side effects or consequences. Here, each side effect corresponds to a dimension in our 2D goal space. If you take all your actions, which are now vectors in the goal space, and add them, this will give a strong indication where in the goal space you are likely to end up. A complementary way of mapping out the consequences would be to think of the goal as a horizontal line with positive and negative effects branching out of that line. For those familiar with fishbone diagrams, this is the reversive one. The taken position is a zeroth order effect, and it has first order effects. Positive effects go over the line, negative effects go under the line. Each effect also has second order effects. Positive effects go over the line, negative effects go under the line. It's difficult to say if a position that has a weak positive first-order effect with a strong negative second-order effect or a weak negative first-order effect with a strong positive second-order effect is net positive. If this can't be determined, the behavior is too complicated and should be avoided. Hopefully this won't be a problem and second-order effects can be ignored. However, sometimes second and even third-order effects either add up or accumulate undetected for a long time before triggering a spectacular event. As a general rule, if adding up the side effects doesn't create a positive bias, then the entire goal structure should be reevaluated. Let us consider a few examples. For a hobby, the zeroth order goal is to have fun. The first order negative side effect is that it costs money. Another first order negative effect is that it may require space. This space requirement has a second order negative side effect in that this too requires money. A first-order positive effect may be meeting new people. A second-order positive effect of that is that this could allow for professional networking. A third-order positive effect is that this could lead to a job. For a side business, the zeroth order goal is to learn how to run a business. Startup costs are a first-order negative effect. Income is a first-order positive effect. For many, income might be the zeroth order goal. Running a business has a time cost which may be positive or negative. Regardless, a positive second-order effect of this is that this time is not spent spending money. For a job, the zeroth order goal is to earn money. Developing a career is a first-order positive side effect. Being stressed or unhealthy is a first-order negative side effect, as is the cost of business attire and keeping up appearances. A second-order negative effect of this is spending money to make up for this either by taking drugs or shopping. These are just examples. For instance, the zeroth order goal of the job may be to develop a career rather than earning. In that case, put career as the zeroth order goal and the money as a side effect. If clothing is supplied, this is a positive side effect rather than a negative side effect. Now, think of your own reverse fishbones in terms of how you spend most of your time and energy. This may also include family, education, sports, religion, retirement, and things you're not currently doing but could be doing. Consider the sum total of all the effects of your actions. Since adopting specific actions will lead to specific outcomes, all effects can be considered goals, whether you actually want to achieve them or not. You may find some of these goals to be counterproductive. Some goals involve saving money, while others involve spending money. Some goals involve getting or being healthy, while other goals are unhealthy. Indeed, if you map out a typical lifestyle, you will probably find a lot of counterproductivity. When a strong positive goal is countered by smaller negative goals, the result is friction. Friction produces waste. Waste is prevalent in modern life. Just consider how many people drive. First, the foot goes on the accelerator, then 10 seconds later it goes on the brake, turning kinetic energy into waste heat. Then it goes back on the accelerator again to make up for the loss of speed. This results in poor gas mileage, as gas is used to heat up the brake pads, and equivalently poor life mileage when the same habits are used in everyday life. The same vehicle gets different gas mileages depending on the driver. Similarly, money gets different mileage depending on who is spending it. Conversely, if one positive goal is positively aligned with another positive goal, both goals benefit. The vectors point in the same direction in the goal space. To achieve such synergy, count up actions and list the effects. Effects may be positive or negative. Without synergy, negative effects will often cancel out positive effects, or effects will be very scattered. Synergy concentrates the effects or goals. If you don't see a concentration of goals, you must change some of your behaviors, and perhaps adopt new ones. For example, one of the things I had to do when starting on the path to early retirement was to replace my money-wasting and generally unproductive hobbies with hobbies that were free and meaningful, in order to A, not cause friction with my money saving, B, provide meaning that was unrelated to work, and C, learn new skills applicable to work, like programming and writing. A web of goals. Having thus whittled down the number of available behaviors to a number of strategies that have mostly, optimally, exclusively positive benefits, at least to the first order, but feel free to continue the exercise to higher orders, it is possible to use a simple form of systems thinking to assemble modules for an overall strategy. Yet unlike the traditional approach to systems theory, which aims to include an increasing amount of existing problems to be solved, generally in a reactive fashion, since the previous lack of systems thinking created them in the first place, the web of goals strategy aims to solve problems proactively by creating solutions that could be part of a wider strategy in the future. Another way to think of this is that this strategy maximizes opportunities and changes according to which opportunities bear fruit. It's an opportunist's approach, which incidentally affirms the Renaissance man's position in the economic and social ecosystem. Yet another way to think of it is, like the name suggests, a web that catches, covers, and holds all the individual issues that are important to the person, such as health, wealth, and wisdom. Here is how to build the web. Each module will have one to several goals, namely zeroth and first-order effects. Here I just ignore higher-order goals because their impact is typically small. Suppose the simple living module has frugality, savings, and less clutter as goals. These form a triangle. Now consider the career module, which has savings, less clutter due to being engaged in the career rather than buying rewards for suffering through a job, resume building, and writing skills. Those are 4 goals. This forms a square. The square shares 2 goals with the triangle, so they should be attached to each other at those points. Now add the exercise module. If bodyweight exercises are picked, the goals would be less clutter, health, and healthy cooking. Less clutter already exists, so tag this triangle onto that point. The financial independence module has frugality and savings as goals. Tag this module onto the others by adding a half circle. Finally, you might add a hobby module, say healthy cooking and writing about it, with writing skills, networking, and cooking as goals. This was just an example of a web. Now make your own. You can also think of each goal as a skill, or alternatively each module as a skill set. It may be difficult to draw a sturdy web. However, take comfort if your goals are limited in quantity and you can find many activities, or modules, that involve several of them. Like in object-oriented programming, naming the concepts can be the hardest part of this exercise. Tensegrity. Having 3 goals or more for each module builds tensegrity into your plans, and consequently your life. If one goal is pushed away, the other connected goals instantly pull your life in a slightly different direction. These goals can be thought of as backups or secondary objectives, but it is better if all goals are approximately equally balanced in importance. For any given activity, one of the goals should not dominate the others. This approach is very different from the standard advice that encourages you to put all your eggs in the single basket of your job. Having a single goal makes a person effective, but it also makes him vulnerable and subject to discontinuous changes. Plans have to be altered radically or even rewritten completely if this goal fails. Because of its flexibility and adaptability, it is important to realize that the web of goals strategy essentially is a process-oriented strategy, rather than a goal-oriented strategy. On the meta level, a process-oriented strategy is primarily aimed at living, with goals being accomplished as side effects, whereas a goal-oriented strategy is aimed at goals, with living as a side effect. It's natural that employers prefer employees of the latter persuasion, as they can just break goals into smaller goals and hire an employee for each sub-goal. As an individual or a business, the focus should be on the process rather than sub-goals, lest the long-term perspective be lost. This is perhaps easier to explain using sports as an analogy. Most sports require several skills, such as strength, endurance, agility, speed, toughness, stamina, power, analytic aptitude, and teamwork. Here, training generally focuses on at least a few of those skills simultaneously for each training exercise, whereas the game ultimately requires all skills simultaneously. Playing sports with multiple requirements has at least two benefits. First, the more diversified one's sport is in terms of required skills, the easier it is to play any other sport. Second, if one skill is lacking, the other skills can still be built, and they can, to a large extent, compensate for weakness in other areas. 5.2. Tactical Principles. Tactics are often presented as lists. These lists are both helpful and useless at the same time. They are helpful because they allow people to pick up a thing or two that they have not seen before, but they are useless because few people are capable of memorizing hundreds of little rules that might not even apply directly to their situation, and remember to obey all of them. In that sense, tips are like a collection of pretty postcards or pictures of specific instances of a particular way of living. They are interesting to look at, but they do not substitute for a map of the lifestyle, nor do they substitute for navigating the map, and most importantly, knowing them does not make anyone an expert. This is why lists and tips in any field, while greatly entertaining, often fail to deliver the desired results. Conversely, once the underlying principle has been identified, the approach becomes intuitive and automatic, thus obviating the need to follow lists and mechanical methods like budgets or diets. The principle is to define a need or want, and then proceed to fulfill that need or want with an appropriate response. An appropriate response to a problem is a solution that uses just enough resources to solve the problem, no more, no less. Since appropriate responses are rarely available in the marketplace, taking existing solutions and modifying them for things they were not intended for is a useful tactic to create more appropriate solutions. 5.2.1. Identifying Needs and Wants. Spend much time reading about budgets or engaging in discussions about lifestyles, and you'll notice that most of them focus on the difference between needs and wants. This often results in normative discussions of what other people should need or want, which usually degenerate into discussions about what is possible and what is not possible. The fact that it is so hard to agree on which is which suggests that the differentiation has become meaningless and thus irrelevant. Conclusion: there are no such things as needs and wants. It's therefore pointless to argue about the difference or make lists of needs and wants. The problem is that needs and wants don't fit on two different lists. They fit on one list where they're ranked according to value, rather than price. Needs and wants are different in degree, not in kind. Consider, for example, shelter. Here, the list of choices may sound like this: sleeping under open air, sleeping under a tarp, basha, or hoochie, living in a tent, couch surfing, living in a shack or a cabin, living in a ship cabin or truck cab, living in a car or a boat, living in an RV, sharing a room with other people, having your own room, sharing an apartment with other people, having your own apartment, sharing a house with other people, and so on. On this scale, there's no demarcation of when a need becomes a want. Each step is slightly different and slightly more expensive than the previous step, with no clear indication of what the bare minimum is, other than having somewhere to sleep. At what point, then, does a want become a need? It could be argued that sleeping under open air in Alaska or Finland will kill you, and that some form of shelter is therefore a need. However, it's possible for people living in Finland or Alaska to move south, so shelter isn't an absolute need. Rather, it's shelter in Finland or Alaska that is an absolute need, insofar that staying alive is a need, but nobody needs to live in Finland or Alaska, even though I'm sure those are nice places. This is similar to how many people consider a $1 million retirement portfolio a need. However, it's their want of a $40,000 retirement income that makes it a need, and only that. It's not an absolute need. Even though the rankings on this list probably match the rankings of most people, it's by no means universal. Having experienced the freedom of living in an RV or a boat for a while, some people would never dream of substituting this for a 4,000 square foot McMansion with its endless cleaning and maintenance issues and the need for walkie-talkies to find lost family members. The list is individual because any choice has consequences in other domains. For each individual, there are similar lists for eating, clothing, transportation, health, time, tools, toys, activities, status, and so on, each ranging from essentially zero cost to more than one can imagine. These can also be classified into tangibles like air, water, food, sanitary, shelter, communication, transport, health, and security, and intangibles like time, relationships, affiliation, power, and achievement. Some of these, like security and sanitation, we take for granted living in the developed world. For others, except perhaps air and clean water, there's a large range of possible consumption levels. For instance, the eating list ranges from roadkill and dumpster diving to industrially processed food to gourmet meals and fine dining. Clothing ranges from going naked to owning just one set of clothes to owning massive wardrobes full of shoes and tailor-made suits. Transportation ranges from walking barefoot to driving a hoopty, to private airplanes and mega yachts. Health ranges from being strong physically and mentally, to being on prescription medicines, to being entirely dependent on advanced medical infrastructure. Time ranges from being a galley slave to working 8 to 10-hour days in a tolerable job, to doing what you want, which may or may not include what is otherwise classified as work. Completing these lists is left as an exercise for the listener. In fact, such an exercise is highly recommended. Try to make it as wide-ranging as possible, and as complete as possible. It may range wider and include more dimensions than suggested earlier. Each level on each list has a price and a value, which is individually unique. The ultimate goal is maximizing total value while minimizing the total price. While the locked-in lifestyle described in Chapter 2 provides a default choice of levels, it's possible to choose one's levels very differently. For instance, instead of choosing a career in a cubicle, a 5-bedroom, 3-bathroom home on a 30-year mortgage, and a new TV on credit, one may choose financial independence and early retirement. 5.2.2 Building Blocks. The world is like a box of Legos. A box of Legos comes with blocks and instructions to build a particular model or product out of the blocks. Specifically, blocks plus instructions equals the model. However, the world is normally not perceived as a box of Legos. Mostly, the accompanying instructions are followed slavishly, and the fact that the blocks can be combined creatively into new models is forgotten. This turns the box into a kit model. Mentally, this reduces the concept of a building block from something that can be creatively combined in many different ways to being merely Part 27A, which is to be fitted with Part 27B in Step 8. Even worse, much of the world comes pre-assembled. With the blocks thus gone, this reduces the equation to instructions equals the model. Often the instructions are reduced and simplified under the mantra of being easier to use. This reduces not only the creativity of the user, but also the operating skills, which are transferred into the model or product. The product turns from being low-tech but high-concept to being high-tech but low-concept. The beauty of this from a business perspective is that each model can be turned into a profitable product and sold separately. This is the reason that we now have electric rice cookers, egg cookers, bread makers, toasters, hamburger cookers, and so on. And as a consequence, people have forgotten how to fry an egg in a pan, amongst other things. Hence, the equation has been reduced to product equals the model, where the only instruction people need to know is get into your car and drive down to a shop and buy the product. Then go to work and make money to pay for it. At this level of incompetence, success can only come from buying a product. More products, more success. This is expensive and wasteful. Just think of how many times a pan and a heating element are replicated in the appliances mentioned earlier. Not to mention that electricity is a really inappropriate source of heat. To avoid this waste, we must relearn how to fry an egg. specifically by realizing that frying an egg first and foremost requires a surface that transfers heat and a source of heat, and not necessarily the Wonder Fryer 3000. In more general terms, we must once again perceive the building blocks to construct more economical solutions. This doesn't mean that you literally have to go and take your appliances apart. Rather, it means considering what kind of utility a product provides and what kind of need or want you have, and then think of other more economical means of solving a specific problem by using a different way of putting the blocks together. Focusing on utility rather than consumer products or instructions is a key tactic. Success is then redefined from accumulating and consuming the maximum number of products or the most expensive products to deriving the maximum utility. Having been raised on products, a key challenge for recovering consumers is to identify their actual core needs and wants. The reason that this can be challenging is that consumers are used to associating needs with products. For instance, it's hard to disassociate being free from headaches from taking headache pills, or to disassociate losing weight from buying the Fat Master 3000. Or to pick a simpler example, imagine a dog needing to get onto a couch. The utility sought is the dog ending up on the couch, and there are many ways to achieve this before buying a dog ramp. If the dog can't jump or be lifted by a human, the dog needs something to step on. That's the utility sought. Something to step on, not necessarily a dog ramp. Consider the ubiquitous box. A box can be used for storage. It can also be used to sit on or support other objects or block a passage. Ideally, a box could be used for many things at once so that it takes up little space relative to its usefulness. For example, several storage boxes could be combined into a dog ramp. Aha! After being decommissioned, it could be cut up for firewood, unless it is made out of plastic and its construction is simple, so you can make it yourself. Failing that, finding box-shaped containers is trivial. A box, particularly a sturdy wooden box, has wide utility and would thus fit well into the web of goals way of thinking outlined earlier. Most important, though, is that its wide utility exists mainly as a potential in your mind. A person with no imagination and few skills will only see the box as a container. Approach the world without prejudice. Start seeing things for what they are and what they can be used for, not what you've been told they're intended for. To do this requires seeing utility from a fresh perspective. This is also called lateral thinking, a kind of thinking that improves with generalization and worsens with specialization, or out-of-the-box thinking, which really originates from having thought in many different kinds of boxes. In particular, it requires a shift in focus from products to components. 5.2.3 Construction Methods. Many rely on their connection to the market through employment and purchasing to satisfy most of their needs and wants. While this makes sense in some situations, for instance, building your own microwave oven from scratch would take a lot of time, it makes less sense in many other cases. In some cases, purchasing is even used to substitute, usually unsuccessfully, for other needs like recognition, meaning in one's life, self-worth, and even using and doing things like recreational shopping. Using the market to satisfy every need is expensive because the market solution is generally not the optimal solution. Often, consumer products come with superfluous frills, side effects, that don't provide the desired utility. Such products waste money and take up space and time. The challenge is thus to distinguish between the need, for example, keeping warm, and the frills, for example, keeping the entire house warm, and then find an efficient, that is, economical, solution. For example, wearing warmer clothing, being physically active, or inviting people over, rather than buy an uneconomical product, for example, central heating. One of the most important aspects of construction is often the most ignored: good raw materials or building blocks. In retrospect, that some ignore the building blocks may not be so surprising when considering the earlier discussion. If the building blocks are poorly chosen, constructing any kind of solution becomes that much harder. Choose the right building blocks using the guiding principles in Section 5.1. Combining wholes, solutions, or products out of parts allows for flexibility and substitutability. Having a product that can't be separated into parts is bad. This is obvious when one of the functions on a gadget breaks. For instance, a modern desktop computer is typically built out of individual, mutually compatible parts, which can be selected and replaced by the user. However, most modern electronics built after the introduction of the integrated circuit are problematic. Complexity, which is better outsourced, as it is impossible for non-experts to understand what is going on. Conversely, mechanical, electromechanical, and thermomechanical engines, or objects built out of wood and metal, are serviceable by intelligent users, since their functionality is apparent by inspection. You can see what each part does, and thus you can repair it if it breaks. Also, if a part breaks, a new one can be made. However, if your product relies on the 8086 chip, a widely used computer chip which first appeared in 1978, you may have a problem sourcing it these days, and you definitely can't build your own. You are trapped. Next, consider whether the something has multiple uses. Does it serve more than one purpose, or can it serve alternate purposes? In particular, can it serve as one thing first and end up serving as another thing? A wooden spoon turns into firewood at the end of its serviceable life, for example. Obviously, raw materials are closer to being able to serve multiple purposes, but even completed products can have multiple uses. For example, a computer can act as a media center, whereas a media center, TV, stereo, and cable box, can't act as a computer. This isn't strictly a technology issue. Can any given shirt in your wardrobe be combined with any given pair of pants and look good? In the kitchen, the chef's knife is probably the most versatile, after the spoon and the pot, unless you're a vegetarian, in which case a serrated utility knife is better, as it doesn't require sharpening nor a cutting board. What are the optimal ways of putting solutions together to find the maximum range of use? Turn the problem on its head by changing it. Instead of looking for blocks for instructions or ingredients for recipes, look for recipes for ingredients. This is strongly facilitated by carrying many recipes, that is, ways to accomplish something, in your head. This way the complexity is internalized and becomes a design problem rather than being externalized as a logistical problem. For instance, when shopping for groceries, knowing many recipes by heart allows one to tailor what's for dinner to whichever loss leaders are on sale, rather than venturing out with a shopping list and having to buy single missing ingredients. If you only have a hammer, the whole world becomes a nail. The most common hammer is in the shape of a credit card. The more myopic the focus on a particular method, the more difficult the solution. If and only if the focus is on the wrong method, and it can't be correct all the time if you only have one. For example, when tackling an obstacle like a heavy weight, don't remain confined to seeking out ways to make the weight lighter. A different solution is to become stronger. Changing the focus is similar to changing the problem, except in the latter case the idea is to collect many similar methods. When changing the focus, the idea is to know many different methods. Most wants are internal, so focusing internally and doing without is often a less complicated way to solve a problem, as it mainly requires strength of character, rather than skills or connections. Rendering wants superfluous requires little technical skill, but it does require motivation and self-discipline. Giving up wants can be as tough or easy as going on a diet, giving up smoking, or changing other habits dependent on strength of character. However, doing without is often thought of as a sacrifice, especially when strongly attached to material comforts. It's quickly realized, after about a month, that happiness does not stem from being surrounded by possessions, but that being surrounded by them is the result of an addictive habit. Thus, it can be tremendously liberating not to need something to be happy. Since humans need very little, eliminating various wants can go far in terms of solving problems. Can't afford it? Don't want it. Too complicated? Don't want it. Reduce and simplify. Reduce and simplify. An entire aesthetic can and has been formed around this principle, and so the pleasure from following this path can be as strong as the previous pleasure of accumulation. However, as there's a point of diminishing returns to the pleasure of accumulation, there's also a point of diminishing returns to the pleasure of giving things up. The optimal point is somewhere in the middle. It should therefore be kept in mind that while eliminating problems can be a very good tool, some will be very tempted to make it their only tool, in which case it becomes a hammer for which the whole world becomes a nail. Once you've developed a greater freedom to choose by changing some needs into wants, you can tailor your wants to areas that are supplied freely or at least inexpensively. Much free or almost free stuff comes from the tremendous amount of waste generated by a culture where things are being bought, used once, and then put away into attics, garages, extra bedrooms, and ultimately the landfill. Methods for getting things for free are social in nature, relying on connections to others, these days often on the internet, with like-minded people, keeping track of who has or needs what, and making the connections either through donations, swapping, bartering, or lending. Getting and providing things for free provides value to society insofar as it keeps things out of the landfill and reduces the sales price of newly produced things. Providing things for free provides value insofar as it prevents further consumption of finite resources and maximizes the use of our productive efforts. It's somewhat likely that you're only going to use a given item a few times yourself, too. Sending it along, thus instituting a kind of serial ownership, maximizes its total use. Serial ownership creates a form of decentralized library. While there are websites which bring serial owners together, availability is limited since people are free to keep things as long as they wish, and many do keep their things around just in case. Serial ownership can easily be developed as an attitude simply by selling things once they're no longer in use. To minimize depreciation costs, buy and sell used. The total cost of ownership will be minimal. Often things go out of use because they break and the owner doesn't know how to fix them. Such things can frequently be acquired very cheaply or for free. Sadly, they're often thrown out immediately, so if you're looking for broken things to rescue, you must be vigilant. Often these things are easily fixable. Bicycles with loose brakes and flat tires, lawnmowers with dirty spark plugs, furniture with loose screws, and a person with a few simple repair skills can fix them. Repairing many things is surprisingly easy. Most mechanical items are put together with nuts and bolts and only require a set of the right wrenches or screwdrivers. Beginners should at the very least be able to replace a broken part. The trick is to find out which part is broken, but keep using the replacement method and you will find the right part. If you get your networking and repair skills down, you'll find yourself buying mostly the missing parts for your solutions and tools to fit them in. Buy tools that last a lifetime and this phase will soon be over. After all, any finished product can usually be had for free. The most important thing to remember is that the price of anything is not determined by how much effort went into the production. If it was, I should be paid as much for writing this book as an actor gets for a movie. Nor does it depend on the level of specialized knowledge required for the job. If it was, I should have earned more than $40,000 per year after spending 10 years to acquire what corresponds to a master's degree in nuclear physics and a PhD in astrophysics, given that you can also earn this salary as a toll booth operator. Nor is it determined by any kind of inherent value. If it was, school teachers would be paid more than professional athletes and bankers. It's strictly determined by how much the seller can get. This took the economics profession hundreds of years to figure out. Since there are different sellers with different levels of knowledge about their customers, prices vary. When buying parts, tools, as well as new things, always try to get 3 different prices across markets, new and used, and time. Do prices tend to go up or down? Are they seasonal? To get an idea of the effective price. Memorize the prices for anything you buy regularly. Parts for food, also known as ingredients, come to mind. If memory is failing, keep a price diary. Only issue limit orders, that is, don't buy until the price falls below some predetermined level. Patience is rewarded more often than not. Let current purchases determine what problem you're currently solving rather than the other way around. Adapt your plans to what is on sale. Given the price, consider whether it's worthwhile to buy the part or manufacture it yourself. This comes down to valuing your time earning or otherwise making money versus your time fixing the problem directly. When buying products, you're paying for time, materials, and knowledge. You probably have plenty of time. You've listened this far into the book. Materials, especially when bought in bulk, are shockingly inexpensive, and often the knowledge required to do a job is overestimated. This means that most people do not properly value their own knowledge, having been convinced that an expert must always be consulted. However, if you can add and subtract, you can do your own taxes. If you can keep an appointment, you can garden. And if you can peel a potato and tell time, you can cook. These days there are plenty of tutorials online and in books that will teach you how. With just a little experience, the only thing that will separate your work from that of a professional is that the professional can do it 5 times faster than you can do it, the first time. This means that anything done more than once is worth doing yourself. To wit, I can cook my favorite food better than a restaurant because I have cooked this dish more than 100 times, while a professional chef may only make it once in a while. I can do it cheaper as well, since I work for myself for free. If I have a problem with the plumbing or a binding door, I can get immediate service because I can fix the problem myself. If the problem reappears, I know what the problem is and I can fix it much faster than calling a plumber or a carpenter. Once you can make things, you can also provide value to others. The greater the variety in the things you make, the greater the likelihood that you can contribute your skills. Bodging is probably the first step in making things. Not to be confused with the art of botching, which is the art of screwing things up. Bodging is the art of improvising a working solution using whatever is on hand. Duct tape comes to mind. A few people seem to possess this as a natural ability, but for the average man, bodging has been suppressed by a sea of experts and professionals. The general consensus is that now you better get an expert opinion before you engage in almost anything. Better yet, just pay the expert and let him do it for you. Once this mental constraint has been removed, it becomes possible to bodge. For example, did you know you can remove rust by scrubbing it with a pad of aluminum foil? I found out on the internet. Make a pad out of the foil, put some light oil on it, and scrub away. Once you understand why this works, aluminum foil is harder than rust but softer than the good metal and even most paint jobs, you realize that the oil is just there to provide lubrication. You could use anything, including spit. For more advanced rust removal, you can use electrolysis. While many hobbyists and mechanics use this method routinely, most have only seen this in action in a high school or university laboratory and haven't thought that the principle could be applied outside the box of a laboratory setting. Use a 2-amp non-digital car battery charger for the electric source and sodium carbonate, also known as washing soda or pH upper or booster for your pool, mixed in water for your electrolyte. Attach the part to be cleaned to the negative clamp and some piece of scrap iron to the positive clamp. Bodging enters because you don't need to specifically use sodium carbonate. You could also use sodium bicarbonate, also known as baking soda. The only downside of sodium bicarbonate is that it doesn't work as well, but it will work. The concentration of sodium carbonate doesn't matter very much. More is slightly faster, nor does the current. Higher is slightly faster. If you understand the principle of how ions move, you'll quickly realize that rust is removed along the line of sight to the positive clamp. However, you don't need to understand this to observe that it works. Just keep repeating to yourself, this isn't rocket science. However, bodging requires another skill to be developed: common sense. We have been educated to follow instructions because it moves personal responsibility one level of management up. Yet if you're bodging, all responsibility is yours. You must know what you're doing. Notice that bubbles appear around the negative clamp. This is hydrogen. Hydrogen is explosive. Think Hindenburg disaster. So don't use the water in your rust removal setup to extinguish cigarettes, and keep it in a ventilated area. This is common sense. Furthermore, you might think that ordinary kitchen salt might make a great electrolyte. However, the chemical name of kitchen salt is sodium chloride. Since we are bodging, we might produce some unintended consequences. If the ingredients are sodium and chlorine, those consequences are chlorine gas, which was used as a war gas in World War I, and sodium hydroxide, caustic soda. Chlorine gas also burns explosively with hydrogen, much like pure oxygen. It was a combination of oxygen and hydrogen that blew the roof off the Chernobyl reactor. From a general knowledge of history and chemistry, it should therefore be clear that kitchen salt and sparks from cigarettes or nearby battery chargers should be avoided. Also, don't stick your hands into the conducting water. Bodging doesn't require an advanced education, but it does require a real education connecting what you've learned to real-world problems. It's interesting to note that the more you know, the more likely you are to worry about the risks of bodging. Yet, the more you know, the more you realize that often even experts are simply bodging. You may find this comforting or worrying, depending on your personality and how much you know. One problem with bodging is that it's difficult to tell whether someone is winging it or actually knows what they are doing. A good way to tell an expert bodger from a pseudo-expert is to see if the bodger understands why he is doing something a particular way. If he mentions beliefs, authority, or others, chances are good that he is winging it for personal gain. Be honest about yourself. If you can't bodge, delay the project and work on something easier until you can. Bodging transitions smoothly into fixing things. Fixing things, or rather parts, eventually transitions into creating parts. First, you'll be creating replacement parts, but eventually you'll be creating your own parts. At this point, you'll thoroughly understand the technology you're using and be ready to make your own custom-made tools to solve problems. This way of learning differentiates itself from the educational system because it is real learning. That is, learning by doing rather than learning by taking notes, passing tests, and getting degrees. When I, having gone through the latter process, talked to people about how they learned to fix engines, I was surprised to learn that very often they had never taken a course. The typical story was that at some point they had gotten a broken engine and simply tinkered with it until it worked. Each new method requires further development of skill, and you may find yourself transitioning through different stages depending on your other skills and personality. At any point in time, one stage may dominate your thinking, since few will be able to develop all skills equally fast. Those with strength of character will seek to change, simplify, and downsize, as it goes well with doing without things. Once a resilient network has been established, bartering, swapping, and wheeling and dealing will become more exciting than simplifying. Technical skills ultimately lead to creative pursuits, building and making things, and rarely doing without, despite rarely buying anything. In my case, I quickly found myself cooking my own meals and giving things away and acquiring others for free, whereas it took me a long time to start a garden, and I'm still learning to fix motors and build furniture. Other journeys may be different. 5.2.4 Appropriate Response. Materialism has a fascination with overbuilding, oversizing, and overcompensating. This is bad economics. Consider that for each thing that gets overbuilt, there's something that doesn't get built. For each thing that gets underbuilt, there's something that must be replaced when it breaks. Both problems mean that resources are wasted. Resources are wasted when the response is not appropriate for the situation. Responses can be divided into labor, capital, and management. Many are short on skill, management, and time, labor. Therefore, money, capital, is spent to compensate. Hence the existence of automatic egg boiler gadgets and other atrocities. What is ignored here is that the opportunity cost in terms of time spent working or watching TV and time not spent learning a skill, such as how to boil an egg, is often higher than the cost in time to learn to boil an egg in a pot and actually do it. Indeed, the time savings of gadgets is often overestimated, while the time needed to learn a skill is equally often overestimated. This is particularly true since many capital assets are just sitting around, serving no purpose most of the time. Conversely, if a job is going to be repeated often, it makes sense to buy a labor-saving device. Ignoring skill for the moment, the simple trade-off between capital and labor suggests total cost as a function of rate of use, with anything used less than once a month warranting improvisation. Skill makes the use of time and capital more efficient. Except at a very high level, maintaining skill has no cost. So if something is learned once, no further effort is required. In this case, it's sensible to develop a skill just before the point that it begins to require maintenance, continued practice. Beyond this point, replacing skill and time with capital assets makes more sense. The skill component is something that consumers frequently misunderstand. A skilled response can easily be many times more efficient than an unskilled response. Conversely, the same ratio doesn't hold in terms of capitalization. For example, an expensive car won't be much faster than an inexpensive one. Similarly, a whisk will only be a few minutes slower than a hand mixer, not counting the time one must work to earn the money for a hand mixer. Consider the difference between an experienced swimmer and a beginning swimmer. The former is fast and the latter is slow. This, however, doesn't mean that the faster swimmer expends much more energy than the slow swimmer. The experienced swimmer is much more efficient and seemingly glides through the water, whereas the beginner is inefficient and struggles just to keep his head afloat. Money handling skills are very similar. The experienced money handler knows exactly where and how to spend money to get the maximum out of it. An unskilled money handler spends money everywhere, too much on some things, too little on other things, with much going to waste. Sigmoids, logistic curves, and the maximum power principle. One popular psychological strategy is to set small goals or start slowly. Slow change is comfortable change. However, the cynic may observe that with an eternal series of baby steps, nothing much actually changes. This strategy usually fails from the lack of meaningful progress, despite having achieved several small goals. While it will work given a lot of patience, this patience is often hard to achieve. A sigmoid S-curve, or logistic function, is a useful model to explain why this strategy rarely brings the intended results. This curve can be used to describe return on effort, in terms of effort, for many different kinds of effort. Here, the horizontal axis describes the effort, which describes some kind of input, and the vertical axis describes the return on effort, which measures output. For example, the input could be time and the output could be money. The input could also be work, and the output could be happiness or fitness or so on. Note that the curve would be symmetric around the origin, where its rate of change is fastest. For the sake of discussion, let's consider a variable p, and think of it as production. One way of thinking about p would be in terms of the cumulative number of pages I have written as the book project has progressed. The increase in production is proportional to the current production, because having already written and thought about the subject makes it easier to write more about it. However, the increase in production is also proportional to the potential for further production. In the beginning, this potential is high because there are many things left to write about. But as the book gets closer to the end, there are fewer topics to write about, and so it becomes harder to just pick one and write about it. With few resources, the ability to change will be proportional to the resources. This works like compound interest, and it'll create exponential growth. However, compound interest in itself never made anyone rich. Invest $1 at 8% and wait 30 years to get $10. This is hardly a worthwhile sum for 30 years of waiting. But invest $100,000 at 8% for 30 years and you get $1 million. That is real money. To get anywhere, it's thus very important to quickly build a substantial foundation. Setting small goals in a situation which depends on exponential growth is a guaranteed way of not seeing results very fast. Conversely, putting in a large initial effort is a guaranteed way of seeing immediate and growing returns. The middle of the S-curve shows a proportional relationship between effort and results. Work more and get more results. Work less and get fewer results. In other words, this is the stage where extra effort is rewarded more than it was in the beginning, because it's leveraged by the now higher production. With further effort, the production ceiling starts to kick in due to limits on resources, customers, responsibilities, market size, and so on. You might have found yourself with a job description that could be done in 3 hours a day, even though you nominally have to work for 8 hours. If so, you know what I mean about reaching the productivity ceiling. In such a situation, it makes little sense to increase work effort by 25%, if the return in productivity only increases by 5%. In such a case, it is better to start additional projects, look for more responsibility, or learn something else. These projects would then each have their own curve for you to progress along. The optimal life strategy is to maximize total production for all the things you engage in, or whatever the curves are measuring. Presumably, you'd have a curve for each project and multi-dimensional returns for each project where total utility is maximized. Price-wise, it would be impossible to quantify because it would require you to determine the exchange rate between health, money, satisfaction, meaning, and so on, some of which can't be quantified. Those values can be subjectively determined, though. Given a finite effort, you only have so many days left to live. Total production is optimized by maximizing the return on effort for each project. That is a key statement and is related to the maximum power principle of ecology. What this means is that effort must be distributed between projects for maximum return on total effort. Put in the effort where the yield is highest. The yield is highest where the marginal increase of the return relative to the marginal increase of effort is the highest, which is the middle of the curve. This becomes obvious if we consider the derivative of the S-curve, which looks like a hill or an arc and relates additional effort to additional reward. The derivative curve shows production efficiency as a function of effort, with the highest production efficiency occurring in the middle of the arc at 50% effort. This has a lot of bearing on the discussion of decoupling in section 4.4. In particular, the dynamic region is in the middle of the S-curve and its derivative. The instant response, which requires 100% effort, is to the right, and the static, no response, which requires 0% effort, is to the left. To give an example, professionals are often encouraged to hyper-specialize, that is, to put in maximum effort so that they'll achieve maximum production, the upper right of the S-curve, to win the competition with other professionals and attract the highest salary. If money is the only utility that matters, this is the optimal strategy. If, however, happiness, low stress, leisure time, or other things in the work-life balance also matter, it would result in a different strategy, since the last, say, 80% of the effort to gain the last 20% of the results would be wasted. Once you understand the maximum power principle intuitively, it'll be quite easy to follow. In the simplest terms, it says that you can gain the maximum utility by being relatively competent in large numbers of topics by contributing a non-trivial but fairly small effort. This means that you may gain more utility by being competent, journeyman level, in 10 different topics than by spending the same amount of time to become an expert in a single topic.